August 8th, 1942. Bamber Bridge, England. A white American sergeant grabbed a black soldier by the collar, dragged him off his chair, and threw him onto the pub floor in front of everyone, just because a British woman had smiled at him. "You don't touch their women," he snarled, pressing his boot against the man's chest. But the woman stood up, looked down at the sergeant, and said, "Get your boot off him, or I'll break it off myself." Subscribe now and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story reaches. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story to the very end, and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. There is a moment in history that almost no one talks about. A moment buried under the noise of battles and borders and the names of generals carved into stone. It happened not on a battlefield. It happened in a small pub in the English countryside on a rainy Tuesday evening, when a young black man from Georgia sat down at a table and ordered a pint of beer, and nobody told him to move. His name was Corporal James Henry Beaumont, and he had never in 23 years of living sat at a counter and been served without someone looking through him like he was made of air. Back home in Macon, Georgia, the rules were simple and brutal. You stepped off the sidewalk when a white man passed. You said, "Sir," to boys half your age. You ate at the back. You drank from the other fountain. You existed in a separate, smaller America that had been carved out for you not by choice, but by law, by violence, and by centuries of deliberate, crushing humiliation. James had been raised by a grandmother who pressed her hand against his cheek every morning before school and whispered the same thing into his ear. "Walk straight, baby. Don't give them a reason." She meant survive. She meant don't die today. She meant swallow whatever they do to you and keep breathing, because breathing is the only victory you are allowed. And James had walked straight his whole life. He had done everything right. He had studied. He had worked. He had joined the United States Army in 1941, 1 year after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, because someone told him that fighting for his country might finally make him part of it. Nobody warned him that the Army would be just as segregated as the Georgia street he left behind. The 372nd Infantry Regiment shipped out of New York Harbor in the spring of 1942. Black soldiers below deck, white soldiers above. Even the ocean, it seemed, had a color line. When England finally appeared on the horizon, gray cliffs, rising out of a gray sea, James stood at the rail and felt something he could not name. It was not hope exactly. It was something older and quieter than hope. It was the feeling of a man who has been in a cage so long he has forgotten what air tastes like, standing at an open door. He would not understand what that feeling meant until the first night in Bamber Bridge. The village was small and damp and smelled of coal smoke and wet grass. The locals watched the American soldiers march through the main street with open curiosity. Children ran alongside them. Old men leaned on fences and nodded. And the women, the British women, looked at the black GIs the way people look at something they were told was dangerous and are now discovering is simply human. Private Dorothy Carr was 26 years old. She had worked in a munitions factory since the age of 18, had lost her brother at Dunkirk, and had not danced in 3 years. She was standing outside the Red Lion pub with her friend Margaret when the first truck of black GIs rolled past. "Lord," said Margaret quietly. "Don't stare," Dorothy said, but she was staring too. Later that evening, Dorothy went inside the pub. She sat at her usual table near the window and ordered her usual half-pint of bitter. The pub was filling up British men from the village. A few white American soldiers near the back, who had already started trouble the week before by demanding a separate section. The landlord, a thick-necked man named Arthur Henshaw, had told them flatly that this was his pub, and they could drink where he put them, or they could stand in the rain. That night, 3 black GIs came in. James was one of them. He was tall, with careful eyes, and a manner so quiet it made him seem like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He removed his cap when he came through the door. He said, "Good evening," to the landlord. He waited to be directed rather than pushing toward a table. Dorothy watched this. She watched all of it. She noticed the way you notice things when you have been conditioned to notice danger, that there was nothing dangerous about him at all. There was something careful and dignified and deeply unexpectedly gentle about the way this man moved through a room. Arthur Henshaw pointed them to a table in the middle of the pub, not the back, not a corner, the middle. One of the white American soldiers, a sergeant named Horace Caldwell from Alabama, stood up. "You can't seat them there," he said. Arthur looked at him. "Can't I?" "That's not how it's done. I'm not sure what it is you think you're doing in my country," Arthur said slowly, drying a glass with a rag. "But this is my pub, Sergeant, and I'll seat whomever I like, wherever I like. Sit down or leave." The pub was completely silent, 20 people holding their breath. Caldwell looked around the room and realized that not a single British face was on his side. He sat down. But he did not stop watching. James and his 2 companions, Private Luther Graves and Corporal Eddie Doyle, settled in and ordered drinks. They were quiet at first, the way men are quiet when they know they are being watched. Luther kept his eyes down. Eddie stared at the tabletop. James alone looked up and around slowly, as if cataloging the room not for threats, but for something else. Something like the pleasure of an ordinary evening. Dorothy caught his eye by accident. She looked away. Then she looked back because she was tired of being afraid of ordinary things, and she nodded. Just barely. A small thing. James nodded back, even smaller. A secret between 2 people who were not supposed to have secrets. Margaret leaned over. "Don't encourage them," she whispered. "He nodded at me." "Dorothy." He was polite. I nodded back, that's all. But even as she said it, she felt something shifting inside her. Not attraction, not yet. Something simpler and more foundational. The sudden, startling discovery that she had been lied to. That the stories she had been fed, the warnings, the whispers, the things her aunt from London had said about these soldiers were wrong. This man at the center table was not what anyone had prepared her for. He was better. That was the only word for it. Better mannered, better spoken, more careful with other people, more aware of the space he occupied and the effect he had on it. She did not speak to him that night, but she watched him, and when he and his companions stood to leave, standing straight, nodding to Arthur, replacing their caps with the same quiet ceremony with which they had removed them, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt curious. Sergeant Caldwell watched them leave, too. But what was in his face was not curiosity. It was something that had been taught to him from the time he was small. Something passed down like a family heirloom, worn smooth by generations of handling. something that had no name in polite company, but that every black person in America could recognize. In an instant, from 20 yards away in a crowded room. He kept watching the door long after they were gone. James did not know about Caldwell yet. He was walking back through the dark, damp lane toward the barracks, and Luther was talking about a letter from his wife in Detroit, and Eddie was laughing about something the landlord had said, and James was quiet. He was thinking about his grandmother. He was thinking about how she would not believe this. A pub in England, a table in the middle of the room, a white woman who nodded at him like he was a person and not a warning. He thought, I did not know the world could feel like this. He thought, what kind of man might I have been if I had grown up somewhere like this? He did not yet know the price of that thought. He did not know that within the week, Sergeant Caldwell would file a report claiming that the black GIs were behaving inappropriately with British women. He did not know that the American military command would use that report to propose off-limits orders on British pubs that welcomed black soldiers. He did not know that the British would refuse. That pub, owners across Lancashire, would hang signs that read, "This establishment welcomes all British subjects and black American soldiers. Others may enter at the landlord's discretion." He did not know any of that yet. He only knew that for the first time in 23 years, he had sat at a table in the middle of a room and not been told to move, and that a woman had looked at him, not through him, not past him, not at him, the way people look at something that frightens them, but at him, the way people look at other people. It was such a small thing. It was the smallest thing in the world. And it broke something open in him that he had not known was closed. Dorothy Carr did not sleep well that night. She lay in her narrow bed above the munitions factory dormitory, staring at the ceiling, and kept seeing it over and over, the way James had placed his cap back on his head when he left the pub. Slow, deliberate, like a man who had decided somewhere deep inside himself that every small action he performed would be done with dignity, because dignity was the one thing no one could take from him without a fight. She had never seen a man wear dignity like that before, like armor. Margaret had told her to stop thinking about it. "They'll be gone in a few months," she said, pulling the blanket over her shoulder. "And the Americans, the white ones, they'll make trouble if they see you getting friendly with those boys. You know what Sergeant Caldwell said to Ellen down at the bakery? You know what he called her." Dorothy knew. Everyone in Bamber Bridge knew. Caldwell had walked into Ellen's bakery, seen her laughing with two black GIs, and called her something so vile that Ellen had not opened her shop for 3 days afterward. When she finally came back, she hung a small handwritten sign in her window. It said, "All soldiers welcome here. Manners required." It was aimed at one person, and everyone in the village understood exactly who. The next morning, Dorothy went to work. She stood at her station along the assembly line, fitting fuse caps into shell casings, and she thought about James. She thought about the way he had spoken not just to her, but to Arthur the landlord, to his companions, to the room itself. There was no performance in it, no effort to impress, just a man being careful and real and present in a way that most of the men she had grown up around had never managed to be. She thought about her late husband Thomas, killed in North Africa in 1941. Thomas had been a good man, in the way that many men of that era were good, reliable, steady, not unkind. But he had never once, in their 4 years of marriage, asked her what she thought about something, and then actually waited for the answer. She had not understood until this moment, standing at a factory assembly line in Lancashire, that she had spent her entire adult life being spoken at rather than spoken to. That evening, James came back to the Red Lion. He came alone this time, which surprised Arthur, who raised an eyebrow as he set down a glass. "Where are your friends tonight, Corporal?" "Luther got a letter from his wife," James said. "Bad news. He needed quiet. And Eddie found himself a card game. Somewhere he probably shouldn't have." He paused. "I needed air." Arthur nodded. He understood needing air. He had fought in the First War in the mud of Passchendaele, and for years afterward the only thing that kept the memories from climbing on top of him was the smell of a pub in the evening. Hops and wood smoke, and the low rumble of ordinary human company. He set a second glass down, filled it from the tap, and pushed it toward James without a word. It was the kind of thing one soldier does for another across 30 years and 2 wars. James looked at the glass, then he looked at Arthur. "Thank you," he said. And the weight in those 2 words was not about the beer. Dorothy came in 40 minutes later. She saw James at the bar. She stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds, making a decision she would spend the rest of her life either defending or being grateful for, and then she walked to the bar and sat down 2 stools away. "Good evening," she said, not looking at him. "Good evening," he said, not looking at her. Arthur placed a half pint in front of her without being asked. Then he found something urgently in need of attention at the far end of the bar. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The pub noise, the clink of glasses, the low conversations, the rain beginning again against the windows filled the space between them. Then Dorothy said, "You're from Georgia." James turned his head slowly. "How'd you know that? You say evening like it has 3 syllables." Something crossed his face. It might have been surprise. It might have been the relief of being seen, clearly by someone who had no reason to see him at all. "Macon," he said. "You know it." "I don't know anything about America except what I've seen at the pictures." She wrapped both hands around her glass. "Is it beautiful, Georgia?" James was quiet for a moment. He looked straight ahead. "Parts of it," he said. "The parts that were made before people like me were brought there in chains." He said it without bitterness, the way a doctor names an illness plainly, because pretending it isn't there doesn't make it go away. "The pines are beautiful, the red clay roads, the smell in summer." He paused. "The rest of it." He stopped. Dorothy waited. She did not rush him. "The rest of it," he said quietly, "will kill you if you let it." She did not fully understand what he meant, but she understood enough. She had lost a brother and a husband to a war. She knew what it was to live inside something that wanted you dead. She nodded, and in that nod was more understanding than either of them could have expressed in words. Then the door opened and Sergeant Horace Caldwell walked in. He saw them immediately, 2 stools apart at the bar. Not touching, not even facing each other, and still his face changed. His jaw tightened. His eyes did the thing they always did, the calculation, the contempt, the ancient machinery of a man who has been told his whole life that certain things belong to him by nature. He crossed the pub in 8 steps. He put his hand on the bar between them, not touching either of them, but claiming the space, and he looked at Dorothy. "You should find another seat," he said. Dorothy looked at his hand on the bar. Then she looked at his face. "I'm sitting where I'd like to sit, thank you. Ma'am, I'm trying to do you a courtesy here." "You're doing nothing of the sort." Caldwell turned to James, and the mask came off completely. "I don't know what they told you about England," he said, low and hard, "but you're still a United States soldier, and there are rules." James did not flinch. He had been practicing not flinching since he was 6 years old. He looked at Caldwell the way a man looks at a storm he has walked through before, not without fear, but without surprise. "I'm sitting at a bar drinking a beer," he said. "That's all I'm doing, Sergeant." "That's not all you're doing." The pub had gone quiet again. That particular silence that a room produces when it knows something is about to break. Arthur Henshaw put both hands flat on the bar and looked at Caldwell without blinking. "Sergeant, I've served your lot for 3 weeks now without a word, but I'll say one word now. Out." Caldwell looked at him. "You don't have authority over—" "I have authority over every inch of this building," Arthur said. "And I'm telling you to get out of it." Caldwell held Arthur's gaze for 5 long seconds. Then he looked back at James, and what was in his eyes in that moment was not just hatred. It was something else, something that Dorothy, watching from 2 stools away, could not name but would think about for the rest of her life. It was fear, not of James exactly, but of what James represented, of a world in which the old order, the comfortable, brutal, deeply familiar old order, was becoming negotiable. Caldwell left. The door swung shut behind him. The pub exhaled. James sat very still. Dorothy noticed that his hands resting on the bar were completely steady. She did not know what that cost him. She did not know about the years of practice, the thousands of moments of swallowed rage and forced calm, and the deliberate, exhausting labor of being a black man in America who wanted to survive to the next day. She only knew that she had never seen anything like it. "Are you all right?" she asked. James looked at her. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at her face. He had careful eyes, deep brown, older than his age, holding something she could not read. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Then almost to himself, "I'm always all right." She heard the lie in it, not a dishonest lie, a survival lie, the kind of lie a person tells so many times, it becomes the only story left. "My name is Dorothy," she said. "James," he said. They did not shake hands. They did not need to. Outside, Caldwell did not go back to the barracks. He walked to the American officers' quarters on the edge of town and knocked on a door. Inside, he spoke for 15 minutes to a man whose name would appear in no newspaper and no public record. He described what he had witnessed. He used words that had no place in a just world. And the man behind the desk listened, nodded, and picked up a pen. What he wrote that night would set off a chain of events that would scar Bamber Bridge forever. It would bring military police and military orders and the full weight of an army determined to keep a color line intact even on foreign soil. It would bring violence. It would bring blood on a Lancashire street on a June night when the whole town would remember exactly where they were standing and what they heard. But none of that had happened yet. In the Red Lion, James and Dorothy sat at the bar. They talked for 2 hours. He told her about his grandmother. She told him about her brother. He told her that the army had assigned him to logistics, carrying supplies, driving trucks, because black soldiers were not trusted with rifles. Insignificant numbers were not trusted with rank, were not trusted with the full designation of soldier, even while being asked to die like one. She listened to this with an expression on her face that he recognized after a moment as genuine anger, not performed, not polite, actual rage on his behalf. He had not expected that. "That's monstrous," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." "And you still came." He thought about that. "My grandmother told me to walk straight," he said. "I'm still walking." Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. Something moved through her face that she did not try to hide. "Your grandmother sounds like she was extraordinary." "She raised me after my mother died," James said. "She worked in a white woman's kitchen for 40 years and came home every evening and made dinner and helped me with my letters and never once, not once, let me feel like I was less than anyone else on earth." He stopped. His voice had changed. Something in it had gone very quiet. "She died while I was on the ship coming over. I didn't find out until we landed." Dorothy said nothing. There are moments when there is nothing to say, and the only decent thing to do is be present in the silence. She sat with him in it. After a while, he said, "I keep thinking she knew, that she held on until I was at sea so I couldn't come back for the funeral, so I couldn't use it as a reason to stay. She sounds like she knew exactly what she was doing," Dorothy said softly. James nodded. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he picked up his glass and looked at it. "To Rose Beaumont," he said quietly. Dorothy picked up her glass. "To Rose Beaumont." They drank. And in the American officers' quarters across town, the man with the pen finished writing. He blotted the page. He read it back to himself once, and what he had written was not an order yet, but it would become one, and when it did, nothing in Bamber Bridge would ever be the same again. The order came down 3 days later. It arrived not as a shout or a confrontation, but as a typed sheet of paper pinned to the notice board inside the American military headquarters on the edge of Bamber Bridge. James read it standing up, his coffee going cold in his hand. The language was bureaucratic and clean, the way language always is when it is being used to do something ugly. It stated that certain public establishments in the surrounding area were to be designated off-limits to colored troops effective immediately in the interest of maintaining order and discipline. It listed 4 pubs. The Red Lion was first on the list. Luther read it over James's shoulder and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "There it is." "There it is," James agreed. Eddie kicked the wall, not hard, just enough to have somewhere to put the feeling. "We crossed an ocean," he said. "We are literally on the other side of the world, and they brought it with them." James folded the paper back against the board and smoothed it flat with his palm very carefully, the way his grandmother used to smooth a tablecloth before company came, a gesture of impossible composure in the face of something designed to humiliate. "We knew they would," he said. "We always knew they would." What none of them knew yet was what happened in Arthur Henshaw's pub that same morning 40 minutes after the notice went up. A British military liaison officer named Captain Gerald Fowler arrived at the Red Lion before it opened and knocked on the back door. Arthur answered in his undershirt holding a mug of tea, and Fowler handed him a copy of the American off-limits order without a word. Arthur read it. He read it a second time. Then he set his mug down on the kitchen table very deliberately and looked at Fowler. "They can't enforce this," Arthur said. "They believe they can," Fowler replied. "They've sent the same notice to establishments in Preston and Chorley. The American command is arguing it's a matter of military discipline within their own forces. These are British pubs on British soil." "Yes," Fowler said. "They are." Arthur looked at him steadily. "And what does British command say about it?" Fowler cleared his throat. "British command says unofficially that British establishments are under no obligation to comply." He paused. "Unofficially?" Arthur nodded once. "Good." He picked his mug back up. "Then nothing changes." Fowler hesitated at the door. "Arthur, Caldwell has friends, officers, men who think the same way he does and have the rank to make life very difficult for your regulars. I want you to understand what you're walking into." Arthur looked at him over the rim of his mug. "Gerald," he said, "I walked into Passchendaele when I was 19 years old. I think I can manage Horace Caldwell." What Arthur did next became the thing that Bamber Bridge would be remembered for long after the war, long after most of the names had faded. He went to every pub owner, every shopkeeper, every bakery and pharmacy and corner store on the main street, and he told them what the Americans had done. And one by one, without coordination, without any central organizing force, the people of Bamber Bridge made a decision. Dorothy heard about it from Margaret, who heard it from Ellen at the bakery, who had been the first one Caldwell had targeted, who now had a light in her eyes that had not been there 3 days ago. "Every pub on the high street is going up," Margaret said, pulling on her coat before the morning shift. "Signs. All of them." Dorothy stopped. "What kind of signs?" "Black GIs welcome. White Americans at the landlord's discretion." Margaret buttoned her collar. "Ellen made 12 of them by hand last night, her and her daughter. Stayed up till 2 in the morning." Dorothy stood very still for a moment. She thought about James's hands on the bar, perfectly steady. She thought about what that stillness cost. She thought about a woman in Georgia making dinner. Every evening after 40 years in another woman's kitchen and pressing her hand against a boy's cheek every morning and whispering, "Walk straight, baby." "I want one," Dorothy said. "You don't have a shop." "I work on the factory floor," Dorothy said. "I'll put it on my station." Margaret stared at her. "They'll say something about you and that soldier." "Let them say it," Dorothy said, and walked out. James found out about the signs not from a British person, but from Eddie, who came back from a supply run into town with his eyes wide and his voice doing something between laughing and crying. "Brother," Eddie said, standing in the barracks doorway, "you need to walk into town right now and see what these people did." James walked into town. He stood on the high street and read the signs in the pub windows. He read them twice. Luther was beside him, and Luther, who had not spoken more than 10 words at a stretch since the bad letter from Detroit, made a sound James had never heard from him before. It was a short, broken, involuntary sound, the kind that comes out of a person when something hits a place they had spent years protecting. "They didn't have to do that," Luther said. "No," James said. "They didn't." "Why did they?" James thought about Dorothy. He thought about Arthur. He thought about a country that had its own brutal history, with race, its own shameful chapters, its own hierarchies and cruelties, and yet in this village on this street had looked at a piece of paper designed to humiliate human beings and said no. Not strategically, not for political advantage, just no. Because it was wrong, and they knew it was wrong, and they were not willing to pretend otherwise. Because some people, James said slowly, when they see something evil, they don't look away. He paused. We don't have enough of those people back home. Luther nodded. He wiped his face with his sleeve and said nothing more. That evening, Sergeant Caldwell did not come into town alone. He came with 4 men, all white, all American, all carrying the same tightly wound energy of men who have decided that something needs to be corrected and have given themselves permission to correct it. They walked into the Rose and Crown, first saw the sign, and Caldwell tore it off the window with one hand. The landlord came out from behind the bar and told him to leave. Caldwell told him exactly what he thought of the British and their opinions. 2 local men stood up from their table. It did not come to blows that time, but it came close. Caldwell moved on to the next pub, and the next. By the time he reached the Red Lion, word had traveled ahead of him the way word always travels in a small town, fast and accurate. And when he pushed through the door, Arthur was already standing in the center of the room, arms folded, and there were 8 British men behind him. Not soldiers, farmers, factory workers. A retired schoolteacher named Harold, who was 64 years old and 5'6", and looked at Caldwell with an expression of such calm contempt that even Caldwell hesitated for a moment. "Sign comes down," Caldwell said. "Sign stays up," Arthur said. "I will have this establishment declared off-limits to all American personnel." "That'll be a loss," Arthur said. "You represent about 12% of my weekly revenue. I'll survive." Caldwell looked around the room. He was doing the calculation again, the same one he had done before, and arriving at the same answer. Not a single face was with him. There was something in the air of that pub that he had never encountered before, something he did not have the vocabulary for because his entire life had been built inside a system that told him he was the natural order of things. What he was feeling now, standing in Arthur's pub with 8 British working men staring at him without fear, was the sensation of that system failing to operate, of the old machinery grinding against something it could not move. He left. Again. But this time, when he got back to the American quarters, he did not knock on a door. He picked up a telephone. James did not know about the telephone call. He was sitting in the Red Lion with Dorothy, as he had been every evening that week, and they had stopped pretending they were not specifically coming to see each other. Margaret had stopped trying to warn Dorothy. Arthur had stopped finding urgent business at the far end of the bar. The thing between James and Dorothy was not romantic, or not only romantic, it was something more complicated and more essential than that. It was 2 people who had both lost things they could not get back, sitting together in the space where those losses lived, and finding that the space was more bearable with company. That night, Dorothy brought him something. She pulled it from her coat pocket and set it on the bar without explanation. It was a photograph, small and slightly bent at one corner of a young man in a British Army uniform, grinning at the camera with the uninhibited joy of someone who has not yet learned what war actually is. "My brother William," she said. He was 22. James looked at the photograph for a long time. "He looks like he laughed a lot," he said. "He did," Dorothy said. "He laughed at everything, even things that weren't funny. It used to drive my mother mad." She looked at the photograph from across the bar. "I can't remember the sound of it anymore. His laugh. I try, and I can't." She stopped. Her voice had not broken, but it was close. "That's the thing nobody tells you about losing someone. It's not that you forget them. It's that the small things go first, the sound of their voice, the way they walked. And you cannot get those back, no matter how hard you try." James reached out and put his hand over hers on the bar. It was the first time they had touched. Neither of them pulled away. "Tell me something he did," James said. "Something specific, something only he would do." Dorothy looked at him. "What?" "Tell me one thing, specific as you can make it." She thought for a moment. "He used to sing to the cows," she said. "We had a neighbor with a dairy farm. William would go over in the mornings and sing to them. He said they gave more milk when someone was kind to them." She almost smiled. He was probably right. James nodded. "William sang to cows," he said. "Now I know that about him. Now you've given him to me a little bit, and I won't forget it." Dorothy looked at him for a very long moment. Something moved through her that she did not have a name for. Something that felt like grief and gratitude mixed together into a single unbearable feeling. Then her expression changed. Her eyes went past his shoulder to the window. And what was in her face was not grief anymore. James turned. Outside on the street, 3 American military police jeeps had pulled up. Men were climbing out. Not Caldwell's kind of men, not enlisted soldiers running on jealousy and alcohol. These were MPs, official, armed, moving with the flat, purposeful efficiency of men acting on orders from above. Arthur came out from the back and stood behind the bar. The pub had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet when something was about to become irreversible. "What is this?" Dorothy said, standing up from her stool. James did not answer. He was very still, the way he got still when something dangerous was happening, and stillness was the only tool he had. He watched through the window as the MPS spread out along the street. He watched a junior officer unfold a paper and begin reading from it to the crowd that was gathering on the pavement. "James," Dorothy said, low and urgent. "What is that paper?" He knew before he asked. He knew the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it, but because the air changes, because everything goes very quiet, because the birds stop. "It's an order," he said. "A real one this time." And from outside, muffled through the glass, they heard the officer's voice reading the new directive that all colored troops in the Bamber Bridge area were to return to their barracks immediately, that the off-limits designation was now being enforced by military police authority, and that any soldier found in violation would face court-martial. Luther burst through the pub door, breathing hard. "They've got men at the barracks gate," he said. "They're not letting anyone in or out without papers." He looked at James. "Eddie's outside. They already stopped him on the street." Arthur set both palms on the bar. His jaw was set in a way Dorothy had never seen before. "They can't do this," he said. And this time his voice was different, less certain than it had been with Caldwell, because this was no longer one angry sergeant. This was the American military machine. and it had just pointed itself at a Lancashire village, and even Arthur Henshaw, who had walked into Passchendaele at 19, knew the difference between a bully and an army. James stood up from his stool. He put money on the bar, exact change the way he always did. He put his cap on slow and deliberate, the way he always did. He looked at Dorothy, and she looked at him, and in the silence between them was everything that had been building for 2 weeks, all the conversations, all the small recognitions, the toast to Rose Beaumont, the story of William and the cows compressed into a single look that neither of them would ever fully be able to describe to anyone else. "Walk straight," she said quietly. He stopped. His eyes went to her face. "That's what she told you, isn't it?" Dorothy said. "Walk straight." James held her gaze for one more second. Then he nodded, turned, and walked out into the street straight as a man can walk toward whatever was coming. The street outside the Red Lion was not quiet anymore. It was the kind of loud that a place gets right before something breaks. Voices layered on top of voices, boots on wet pavement, the metallic click of a Jeep door, and underneath all of it, the tight, pressurized silence of people who have reached the end of what they are willing to absorb. James walked out of the pub and into the middle of it. The MP officer with the paper was still reading his voice, flat and official, and around him the black G, who had been caught in the street, were standing very still in the way they had been trained to stand. Not in submission, but in the older, harder discipline of men who know that the wrong movement can get them killed. James recognized that posture. He had worn it his whole life. It was the posture of a man who is furious and has nowhere safe to put the fury. Eddie was at the edge of the gathering, and when he saw James, he moved toward him quickly. "They're saying anyone who doesn't return to barracks voluntarily gets detained," he said under his breath. "They've got a list of names, James. Someone gave them a list." James looked at the MP officer. Then he looked past him further down the street where Sergeant Caldwell was standing outside the circle of official activity, arms folded, watching, not participating, just watching. The way a man watches something he caused but wants no official fingerprints on. Their eyes met across the street. Caldwell did not look away. Neither did James. It lasted 5 seconds and contained everything, every humiliation, every boot on every chest, every generation of enforced smallness compressed into the space between 2 men on a Lancashire street in the rain. Then James looked away first, not because he was afraid, because Caldwell was not worth the cost of holding his gaze. His grandmother had taught him that, too, in her way. Don't spend yourself on men like that, baby. Save it for something worth having. He turned to Eddie. "Where's Luther?" "Still inside. The landlord at the Crown is hiding 3 of our boys in the back room." James nodded. He thought for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, "Go back to barracks." Eddie stared at him. "What?" "Go back, voluntarily. Don't give them the court-martial. Don't give them the paperwork. Don't give them anything they can use." He kept his voice very low and very even. "This isn't over tonight. But tonight is not the night to fight it. James." "Eddie." He put his hand on Eddie's arm, brief and firm. "Trust me." Eddie looked at him for a long moment. Then he exhaled through his nose, put his cap straight, and walked toward the barracks road with his back as straight as a board. James was about to follow when Dorothy appeared at his side. He hadn't heard her come out of the pub. She was standing close enough that he could have put his arm around her shoulder, and she was looking at the MP officer with an expression that James recognized because he had seen it on Arthur's face, that particular British stillness that is not passivity, but its exact opposite. "You're going back," she said. It was not a question. "For tonight." She looked at him. Her jaw was tight. There was something working in her face that she was not letting out, and he understood it because he had spent 23 years doing the same thing. "This isn't right," she said. "None of this is right." "No," he said. "It isn't." "Then why?" "Because right doesn't always win on the night it should," he said. "Sometimes right takes longer. Sometimes right takes a whole lifetime, and then gets finished by your children." He looked at her steadily. "My grandmother waited 40 years in another woman's kitchen. She never stopped waiting. She never stopped believing it would come." He paused. "I'm still waiting. I'm still believing." Dorothy looked at him, and her eyes did something he had only seen happen to a person a handful of times in his life. They went still and deep at once, the way a person's eyes go when they have just understood something they will carry for the rest of their days. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "I will," he said. He walked back to barracks. He walked straight all the way. What happened next was not quiet. It was not resolved. It erupted. Because James and Eddie went back voluntarily, but not everyone did. 3 soldiers from the 372nd Men who had absorbed too much men, who were tired of the calculus of survival and had reached the irreducible bedrock of enough, refused the order. The MPs moved to detain them. A British man who had been watching from a doorway stepped forward and told the MPs to leave them alone. An MP shoved him, and the shove, that single, careless, contemptuous shove of a British civilian on British soil by an American soldier, was the match. What followed became known in the dry language of military records as the Bamber Bridge incident. It lasted through the night. Black soldiers, some armed, some not, pushed back against the MPs. British civilians stood in the street with them. Shots were fired. A soldier named Private William Crossland was shot and wounded. Caldwell, who had caused all of this through months of deliberate patient cruelty, was nowhere to be found when the violence finally started. He had gone inside. Of course he had. James heard the shots from inside the barracks and sat on the edge of his cot in the dark and did not move. Luther sat across from him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then Luther said, "My wife's name is Clara." James looked at him. "In the letter," Luther said, "the bad news." He was looking at the floor. "She lost the baby. 6 months. Just gone." His voice was completely flat, in the way voices go flat when the emotion underneath them is too large to carry any other way. "I've been walking around for 3 days, not knowing what to do with that." James sat with it. Outside, the sounds of the street were beginning to settle, not because the anger had resolved, but because anger always runs out of fuel, eventually even the righteous kind. "I'm sorry, Luther," James said. "She's alone," Luther said. "She's in Detroit alone with that." "She knows you love her." "Does she?" Luther finally looked up. His eyes were red. "I'm here, fighting for a country that won't let me drink from the same fountain as a white man. My wife is home alone, losing our baby, and I'm here." The word came out like something being pulled from a wound. "What are we doing here, James? What does any of this mean?" James thought about it honestly the way he thought about everything. He did not offer Luther a comfortable answer because Luther was not asking for comfort. He was asking for truth. "It means," James said slowly, "that the world is wrong and we are still in it, and we are still standing." He paused. "And maybe that's enough for tonight. Maybe tonight still standing is all there is." Luther was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once and lay down on his cot and closed his eyes. James sat in the dark and listened to the street go quiet. 3 days later, the official inquiry began. The American military command wanted the incident classified as a colored troop mutiny. The British liaison officers pushed back hard and formally arguing that the provocation had come from the American side, from Caldwell's harassment, from the off-limits orders imposed on British establishments, without British consent, from the shove that started the physical confrontation. Depositions were taken. Statements were filed. Arthur Henshaw gave a statement that lasted 2 hours and named every date, every incident, every specific thing Caldwell had done and said in the Red Lion over the preceding weeks with the precision of a man who had been keeping careful count. Caldwell was quietly transferred. No public reprimand, no official record of fault. Just a new posting somewhere further from Bamber Bridge, somewhere he could continue being himself without leaving evidence. That was how it was done. That was how it had always been done. The machinery protected its own components regardless of what those components had done, because the alternative was admitting that the machinery was broken. James heard about the transfer from Eddie, who heard it from a British MP corporal, who thought it was the most cowardly thing he had ever witnessed an officer class do, and said so without much editing. James did not celebrate. He did not feel relief. He felt the cold, familiar weight of a lesson he had already known, that the system does not punish men like Caldwell. It relocates them. It preserves them. It finds them a new street, a new pub, a new group of men to humiliate. And it does it all with paperwork and procedure and the appearance of due process. He went to the Red Lion that evening. Dorothy was there. She had heard about the transfer. She looked at him when he sat down and said, "Is it enough?" "No," he said. "But it's something." He considered that. "It's something," he agreed. Arthur set 2 glasses down without being asked. He had stopped pretending there was nothing between them and had moved on to simply accommodating it in the quiet, practical way the British accommodate things they have decided not to argue with. Dorothy wrapped both hands around her glass. "My sister in London wrote to me," she said. "She heard about the signs, about what the village did." She paused. "She said she was proud of us." A complicated expression crossed her face. "I don't know if we deserve to be proud. We hung signs in a window. The men who were actually suffering were your men." James shook his head. "Don't do that," he said. "Don't reduce what you did. A sign in a window doesn't sound like much, but there is a man in Detroit named Luther, whose wife just lost their child, who has been walking around for days feeling like nothing he does matters nothing. He matters, and he walked down your high street and saw those signs and cried." He looked at her directly. "You gave him something. You can't put a weight on that." Dorothy looked at the bar. Her throat moved. "I keep thinking about your grandmother," she said. "Rose, I keep thinking she raised you to be exactly this, exactly the man you are, And she never got to see, she never got to know that you came here and sat in the middle of a room and people were decent to you. She stopped. It doesn't seem fair. It isn't, James said. But she knew it was coming. She raised me for a world that wasn't there yet. That's what she was doing all along. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't raise me for Macon, Georgia. She raised me for whatever came after. She just didn't know what it would look like. Dorothy looked at him. What does it look like? He looked back at her. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, because the answer was too large and too fragile for words, and they both understood that some things survive better in silence than in language. 2 months later, James's unit received orders to move. North Africa first, then Italy. The war was not finished with any of them. He stood outside the Red Lion on his last evening in Bamber Bridge. His kit packed his orders, folded in his breast pocket, and said goodbye to Arthur, who shook his hand and held it a beat longer than a handshake requires. He said goodbye to Dorothy on the pavement. Margaret was there, and she had the good grace to step away and find something else to look at. "You'll write," Dorothy said. It was not a question either. "I'll write," he said. She reached into her coat and pressed something into his hand. He looked down. It was the photograph of William grinning in his uniform, uninhibited and young and not yet knowing. "He should go somewhere worth going," she said. "Take him with you." James closed his hand around the photograph. He felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was nothing but the other weight, the weight of a dead young man who sang to cows and laughed at everything being carried forward into whatever came next. "Walk straight," he said. She smiled. It was the first time he had seen her smile fully, without grief underneath it, without the weight of everything she had lost pressing against it. Just a smile, bright and real and entirely hers. "Walk straight," she said. He put his cap on. He picked up his kit. He walked down the road toward the truck that was waiting, and he did not look back, because looking back was for people who were not sure they were going to make it, and James Henry Beaumont, grandson of Rose, had decided a long time ago that he was going to make it no matter what the world put in front of him. He made it. He came home in 1945, to a country that had not changed nearly enough, to streets that still had separate fountains and separate counters, and all the old machinery of humiliation running as smoothly as ever. But he came home different. He came home knowing what the world was capable of, not the ideal world, not the perfect world, but the actual world, in a village in Lancashire, where people hung signs in their windows at midnight because it was the right thing to do, and they were not willing to pretend otherwise. He joined the NAACP the year he got home. He marched in 1955 and in 1963. He was at the Washington Mall when the speech was given. He was 67 years old when the Voting Rights Act passed, and he sat in his kitchen in Macon, Georgia, and put his hand flat on the table, the way his grandmother used to smooth a tablecloth, and he said her name out loud quietly to no one in the room. And what the British women of Bamber Bridge had understood in their instinctive, untheoretical, deeply human way was something that the systems of power on both sides of the Atlantic had spent centuries trying to bury. That dignity is not something granted by the powerful. It is something carried by the person. It cannot be issued or revoked. It lives in the way a man puts on his cap, in the way he speaks to a landlord, in the way he holds his hands perfectly still when every nerve in his body is screaming. It was there all along. They simply had the eyes to see it. and the courage to say so. And that quiet, unglamorous, practical human courage is what changes the world. One sign in a window at a time. One hand held across a bar, one story told in a pub in England, while the rain comes down and the rest of the world burns.